How much influence is Washington losing in its own backyard? After China hosted major Latin American leaders for a diplomatic conference, the U.S. accused Beijing of trying to seek a military advantage and unfair economic gain. So is it Chinese assertiveness or Latin America's choice to look east rather than north? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Well, Latin America has been known as Washington's backyard, and for decades, the U.S. was by far its biggest trading partner. But today, China has replaced that status with every country in South and Central America, bar Colombia and Ecuador. Not only are they aligned with China on trade, but also on ideology, believing in empowering the global South over a U.S.-dominated world order. Now, that was on display in Beijing when President Xi hosted Latin American leaders, two-thirds of which have already joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. Here's a look.
Latin America has long been considered a key sphere of influence for the United States. But in recent years, China has quietly expanded its presence to become the region's largest trading partner. Formed in 2011, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, or CELAC, unites 33 nations, aiming to foster regional cooperation and assert independence from traditional Western powers, particularly the United States. On May 13th, Chinese President Xi Jinping hosted key Latin American leaders in Beijing, and after the summit, he highlighted shared values while seemingly taking a jab at the US.
There are no winners in trade wars. Bullying and tyranny will only isolate oneself. China and Latin America and Caribbean countries are important members of the global South. Independence and self-reliance are our glorious traditions. Development and revitalization are our natural rights. Fairness and justice are our common pursuits.
Back in 2013, the US was South America's largest trading partner, with $280 billion in total goods trade. By 2023, that had dropped 25%. Meanwhile, China's trade surged 43%, reaching $304 billion and overtaking the US in most of the region. While US attention has been focused on Mexican car imports, the fentanyl crisis, and Chinese companies managing the Panama Canal, China has steadily strengthened its ties across Latin America. Peru is constructing a massive new superport backed by Chinese investment aimed at boosting exports and regional trade capacity. China is also helping Bolivia build one of the continent's largest steel plants, a cornerstone of industrial modernization and economic growth. Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva captured a shared sentiment in the region.
In recent months, the world has become more unpredictable, more unstable, and more fragmented. China and Brazil are determined to unite their voices against unilateralism and protectionism.
China is also easing travel barriers, extending visa waivers to citizens of Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay, a move designed to deepen ties beyond trade.
To further facilitate cross-border travel, China decided to include more countries in its visa waiver program and extend the visa-free policy.
China's Belt and Road investments in the region span energy, transport and industry, fueling economic development, but also raising questions about debt dependence and sovereignty. In Washington, Beijing's expanding influence is viewed warily. The US warns that Chinese loans could trap countries in debt and threaten their political independence. Latin American leaders face a difficult balancing act, embracing China's economic opportunities while navigating geopolitical rivalry and protecting national autonomy. And as the region stands at a crossroads, the challenge will be managing these new relationships without losing control of their future.
So can Latin America find that balance, and will the U.S. change course? if it senses Beijing encroaching on its own proverbial backyard. Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Boston, author of The Non-Aligned World, Striking Out in an Era of Great Power Competition, Chile's former ambassador to China, Jorge Jaime. From Beijing, China commentator Zhao Ying. And from Santiago, Chile, associate professor at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, Santiago Mingo. Thanks all so much for being with me. Jorge, I'll start with you and have you paint kind of a general picture for us as to, what this new dynamic means to Latin Americans. 20 years ago, I think it would have been unthinkable that the U.S. could be surpassed by China in trade, but here we are. So is it good for Latin America, or are there economies now at the mercy kind of a different superpower, as a cynic might say?
Well, let me put it this way. It's important to keep in mind that China's presence in Latin America today marks a major shift, perhaps one of the most important shifts in the region's history over 200 years. Why? Because for, say, the first 180 years of Latin American independence, most relations, diplomatic, financial, trade, investment relations, were with basically two other poles, one the United States, the other Europe. So suddenly, in this century, China has come into the scene. To give you only one number, trade between China and Latin America in the year 2000 was around $12 billion. Last year, it was $516 billion. So a 40-time increase in, a little over 20 years. What does that mean? That for South America today, the number one trading partner is no longer the US, it's no longer Europe,
Right.
It is China. That marks a very important difference. So, and as a rule, it is better to have more partners rather than fewer ones. So I would say that all in all, big picture, it's a good thing to have China in the region.
Okay, let me ask Santiago then from the Latin American perspective. Are Latin Americans themselves excited about this? Or again, there's a reputation, true or false, that sometimes they can get caught in a Chinese debt trap, as was said about Africa. Now, many people will say that is absolutely not true. But what is the perspective from where you are?
Yeah, so this is very interesting because historically it has been very important to be close to your partners in terms of distance, right? But now with globalization and global value change and commerce, technology, it is possible to have a superpower that is farther away. And Latin America is very excited because now it has another country that is investing strategically in the region. It's supporting businesses here. So it's kind of a different dynamic, and we don't have this history or long history with China as with the US. So that has helped because the US, it has sort of the people here a view of an extractive history, okay, extractive natural resources. So, but with China is different.
Yeah, also China's, foreign policy in general is that of non-interference, while historically, especially in Chile, the United States was seen as not just interfering, but actively backing what many people define as a very dangerous, tragic dictatorship. So is this really welcome, particularly where you are in Chile?
Well, I think, as I was saying, it's a very different situation right now. The relationship with China has not turned political, as I see it right now, but the region must take advantage of this in a smart way, because we don't want to have some countries aligned with the US, other countries aligned with China. I think as a region, we would be losing an opportunity because right now if this turns political, might become not as good as we think.
Right. And Zhao Ying, you are aware that there are divisions in Latin America, and I think most worrying about especially the U.S. reaction to China becoming Latin America's biggest trade partner is when Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said Chinese activity in the region is all about gaining a military advantage and an unfair economic gain. So is that what China is really after in Latin America? Are there true strategic, cynical interests to work against the United States?
Well, of course, I mean, I do not think so. I think when President Xi talks about a community of shared future for mankind, the United States is definitely an important part of that vision. And I think it's all about perspectives, because the issue is that while China views Latin America as a region full of opportunities, the US government tends to view it as a region of a source of illegal immigration, of drug trafficking or transnational crimes. But I mean, the Trump administration, one of its top priority is to send those migrants back to Latin America. But let's be honest, no one would, leave their home and risk such long journey to become an illegal immigrant just to make a living in a different country. What people really need is jobs and hope at home. And that is exactly what China is doing there. For instance, under the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been working with Latin American countries on over 200 infrastructure projects that created over 1 million jobs in the region. And that also helped with the economic development in the region, which will help resolve the root causes of illegal immigration. So I think in this sense, China can actually help solve some of the very issues that the U.S. is concerned about. So I think the United States should really give up its Monroe Doctrine that sees the region as its backyard or as its own sphere of influence. But I mean, the region does not have to be a battleground for big power rivalry, but instead it can be a platform where China and the U.S. can cooperate.
It could be, yeah. But let me ask the ambassador, because what Zhao was alluding to there is another issue as well. We now are going to look at potentially millions of migrants having to return to their home countries where some economies are struggling. So how much will Latin America have to adjust those economies, not just to accommodate the returns, but also to adapt to a real loss of remittances into their economy, adding to their GDP? And can China help with that?
Well, absolutely. And that is a real problem, because let us recall that the region in 2020 had its biggest economic downturn in 120 years on the year of the pandemic. It was also the region that was hit the worst in the world by the pandemic in terms of the number of fatalities per capita. And the region is not yet fully come out of that crisis. It is still very much in a low growth mode. So if you add to that the mass deportations of hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions, you can imagine what that would do to the region. So the region must adapt to that. And in that context, I would say that yes, trade and investment from China can make a very significant difference. And here I would like to underline what President Lula and President Boric have said. When President Boric recently visited Brazil, they made a joint statement saying, we don't want to have to choose between China and the United States. We want to do trade, we want to do business with both countries. And that is what we argue, and with my colleagues in this new book, The Non-Aligned World. We say Latin America must stand for active non-alignment. You don't have to choose.
Okay.
You can choose your own path.
And that is ideal, but the problem is when we talk about Latin America striking a balance, they are going to have to take into consideration, I'll call them U.S. sensitivities here, because there are murmurings in the United States that the U.S. should feel threatened by China's presence in Latin America, somewhat similar to the Cold War dynamics with the Soviet Union present in Latin America. So how are Latin American leaders going to face that? Should they have to?
No. First of all, this is very straightforward. The United States must offer concrete incentives, must offer concrete, carrots, if you will, to work with Latin America. This cannot work simply on the basis of sticks and threats. Latin America countries are independent nations. They have their own sovereignty and they make their own decisions. And therefore, what we would like to see is a competition, in fact, that if Latin America wants to build a port or wants to build railways or wants investment in various projects, that US firms put out tenders, participate in bids, much as the Chinese do. What is happening now is that basically the United States is putting out threats, but it's not putting any sort of material incentives for Latin American countries to choose with them. And that, it seems to me, is the wrong approach, and it is not working.
Right. And Santiago, among those threats are, of course, U.S. tariffs, which are hurting the U.S. relationship with Latin America. They're not providing those concrete incentives that the ambassador was talking about. I mean, are they inadvertently pushing Latin America toward China and benefiting the China-Latin America relationship that the U.S. feels threatened by?
Yeah, so that's exactly one of the problems that we're having. These high tariffs, many Latin American countries are struggling economically, and many of them also depend on trade. Okay, so if the U.S. is putting these high tariffs, we still need to grow economically, and we have China to replace some of that trade, and we can strengthen the relationship with China to in some ways address this problem, this trade problem with the U.S. if they start increasing tariffs, and mix with this immigration sending immigrants back. We are already also having a problem with immigration here in the region. So if we see the U.S. as a country that is exacerbating our problems, of course, you start looking to other regions like Asia, China, and even Europe to strengthen those relationships. So what we want here, and I agree with the ambassador, is that we want a cooperation with the U.S., and the U.S. should take a stand of implementing measures that will help to develop the region economically. Okay.
Do you think their America First policy, though, will let them do that? Especially when the United States right now is absolutely insistent on bringing jobs and manufacturing to the United States and taking it away from China and Latin America.
Yeah, so that's exactly the problem that we have right now. But one thing that we need to consider is that we have a lot of natural resources in the region, right? We have lithium, rare earth, mining, agriculture, water. Okay, so there are many, many resources that the U.S. will still depend on, and also China and other countries. So in some ways, it's a moment to the region should come together. It has been historically a very fragmented region, so the region should come together and have some kind of strategy to handle that the position that the U.S. administration is taking, and start developing some cooperations. And in some ways, China, the strengthening of the relationship with China helps in some ways to try to push for a better relationship with the U.S.
Okay, I mean, Zhao Ying, is China somewhat, ironically benefiting, because they're obviously a victim in many ways of this aggressive U.S. tariff policy, but at the same time, because those tariffs are being pretty much placed on everyone outside of the United States, China can actually benefit from that by moving in and investing further in markets outside of the U.S. Those tariffs give China an advantage in Latin America, do they not?
Well, I mean, the tariffs is obviously a wake-up call for many countries that they need to diversify their economic ties and uphold multilateralism so that they can be more resilient in the face of such kind of external pressure. But I mean, China and Latin America share some more, the common interests and strategic interests there that have long been there that goes beyond the U.S. factor. And I think I want to add a little bit to your previous question about this strategic balance by Latin American countries that are caught in between this so-called big power rivalry. I mean, of course, it is not difficult to strike that balance, but I think that's obviously what a lot of Latin American countries are looking for. For instance, if you hear from Brazilian President Lula da Silva, he said at the China CELAC Forum last week that the fate of Latin America does not rely on anyone else. It does not rely on China. It does not rely on the US or Europe. It relies solely and simply on whether we want to be great or continue to be small. And I think no country can really be great by just being a subordinate of a superpower. So, I mean, they need to seek strategic independence. And this is obviously not easy, but I mean, the only way they can achieve this, especially for countries of the global south, is by working together with other developing countries to build a more, equitable world order, a more democratic global governance system in which they can have greater agency over their own economic and foreign policies. I think that is something that both China and Latin American countries are looking for. And this is what fundamentally brings together China and Latin America.
Okay. Well, let me ask you.
Can I add something to that?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Now, what is important here is to look at the sort of more long-term complementarities between China and particularly South America. China has 19% of the world's population, but only 7% of the world's freshwater reserves, and only 7% of the world's arable land. What does that mean? It means that China is unable to feed itself from its own agricultural production. In South America, on the contrary, we have about 25% of the world's freshwater reserves. We have enormous amount of land. It is basically, an underpopulated region. Some of the best land in the world is in Argentina, the Pampa Húmeda. So what I'm saying is that South America can very well feed China in so many ways, and already about a quarter of all agricultural imports from the rest of the world in China come from South America, basically 4 countries in the Southern Cone. So these are, long-term complementarities that are very important to keep in mind beyond, today's, great power rivalries.
Right.
And it's important to keep that in mind.
But Latin America is also up against, ASEAN countries as well as African countries that are trying to fit into those markets as well. But very quickly.
Yeah, can I add to that?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly add to that. So there's a risk also with that strategy of sending resources and basing the relationship with China only by sending resources. Okay, so we want to have also technological development here in the region. We don't want to turn this relationship with other countries into an extractive view of resources because we'll go back to kind of the logic that we have had with the US.
Right.
So we would love to see Chinese companies and the Chinese government pushing for the development of technology and resources that turn into actual products and not only exporting.
And that is, Santiago,
materials.
What everybody wants. The problem is China is a massive producer, and other countries have seen, to be fair, China providing a lot of cheap goods that other countries cannot compete with. And in countries like Latin America, where manufacturing jobs could provide so much income for impoverished communities in particular, how confident are you that that kind of paradigm can change with Latin America and China's relationship?
Well, it's difficult. But I think that that's one point where the U.S. could have an advantage. The U.S. could help to develop these technology value-added products and not only base the relationship on sending raw materials. Okay, so that's key. With the pandemic, we know that we want to have global value chains that are closer to the superpowers, and it's an opportunity for the U.S. to start developing the region and helping to develop technology and industrial development to kind of diversify their own trade networks, because they have based their trade networks on Asia basically during the last.
Let me just get Zhao Ying's perspective then on what China really does foresee as per sharing the economic benefit in this relationship and making it beyond extractive, because China wants to keep its manufacturing, not leaving so much space for those more impoverished communities in Latin America to get the kinds of jobs that they would have the skills for.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with my colleague that at the current stage, Latin America largely imports these manufactured products and high-tech products and then export its raw materials. But this is due to the region's historical role in global trade, because just as the Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano described, this is a region of open veins. It has its natural wealth have fueled the prosperity of Europe and the United States, while the region itself has remained in poverty and underdevelopment, and it has been locked in this low-value, role. But I mean, China actually wants to help the region change this situation. So we see that in recent years, apart from the infrastructure projects, China is aligning its investment and projects in the region with the regional development goals, and also there are expanding cooperation in emerging areas like 5G, artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and electric vehicles, etc. And also there are educational programs. So I think obviously China wants to help Latin American countries climb up this value chain. And also I think Lula mentioned this digital gap, and China is in talks with Brazil to launch the satellites, low orbit satellites that may help people in remote areas of Brazil to get access to the internet. So I mean, China view Latin America as an equal trade partner instead of the traditional role as a backyard. Yeah.
We'll see how that develops. Zhao Ying, that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. Very unfortunately, we're out of time for this episode, but I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.